In 1897, the most consequential industrial patent in American history changed hands. The buyer was not an engineer, not a railroad magnate, but the heir to a beer empire, who paid 1 million gold marks, or roughly $250,000 for a piece of paper that will legally define the American industrial future forever. This is the story of how Adolphus Busch bought the American future of the diesel engine and then, not out of malice, not out of greed, but out of a combination of bad luck, dirty fuel, and sheer industrial incompetence, locked the entire country out of it for 15 years. Rudolf Diesel was not a mysterious figure in 1897. He was a celebrity. His engine had just been demonstrated publicly at the MAN factory in Augsburg, Germany, and the demonstration was the kind of event that people wrote home about. Observers watched the machine run on cheap fuel, run quietly, run cool, and visibly do more work per gallon than anything that they have ever stood next to. It did not smoke the way steam did, and it did not demand the constant stoking and supervision that steam demanded either. The audience at Augsburg could see the difference without being handed a technical report. The numbers confirmed what the eyes already registered. 26 to 30% of the fuel it burned became actual work, against 6 to 10% on a good day for the steam engines, which most of the industrial world was still running on. That gap was not a refinement, it was a totally different category of a machine. In his patent work, Diesel had published theoretical calculations on thermal efficiency. No working engine had ever approached that number. The MAN demonstration brought the real figure down considerably, to somewhere around 26% under load. But Busch was not reading that number the way an engineer would read it. He was reading it the way a man reads it when he has a specific problem that will not go away. Anheuser-Busch's refrigeration infrastructure was not seasonal. It ran continuously, every hour of every day, because the product demanded it. And because competitors in other cities were running the same infrastructure, there was no angle from which Busch could cut that cost by cutting corners. His rivals had the same bill. What he needed was a technology that made the bill cheaper for everyone, but cheaper for him first, because he would actually own the patents. What Busch had that his American industrial peers did not was a specific competitive vulnerability that ran deeper than fuel costs alone. By 1897, Anheuser-Busch was shipping beer nationally, which meant refrigeration was not just a production requirement, it was a logistics requirement. The company ran its own refrigerated railroad cars to move product across temperature gradients that would destroy an uncontrolled shipment. Every mile of that network, every hour of that cooling ran on steam, and every competitor who could reduce that operating cost faster than Busch could would have a structural advantage he could not answer. He was not buying a technology because it was interesting. He was buying it because the alternative was watching someone else buy it first. The man who made the introduction was Colonel Edward D. Meier, a St. Louis engineer who had seen Diesel's work in Europe and came back convinced he was looking at the future. Meier found his way to Busch and made the case directly. This engine runs on cheap fuel, it runs efficiently, and the patents are available. Busch listened, and then, in the fall of 1897, he traveled to Munich. On October 9, 1897, Busch signed a contract with Rudolf Diesel for the exclusive rights to Diesel's patents in the United States and Canada. The price was 1 million gold marks, which converted at the time to roughly $250,000. In today's money, that's somewhere in the range of $10 to $12 million for the patent rights alone, and that was just opening payment. Busch reportedly wrote to his son-in-law, Edward Faust, shortly after signing, and his confidence was total. "I am convinced that this engine is the power of the future," he reportedly wrote. "It will revolutionize the world as the steam engine once did." That was not hedged language of a cautious investor. That was a man who believed he had just bought the future. But owning patents to an engine that you can't get to work is not an asset, it's a cage. On January 4, 1898, Busch incorporated the Diesel Motor Company of America in New York, capitalized at $1 million with himself as the primary stockholder. The plan was straightforward: build the engine, install it, demonstrate it, and license it to the American industry. By September of 1898, among the first commercial diesel engines in the world and the first in North America was installed and running at the Anheuser-Busch brewery in St. Louis. It was a 60 horsepower, 2-cylinder unit, and by every account it was a mechanical nightmare. The engine ran, technically, but it knocked, it fouled, and it produced irregular power, which meant the brewery engineers had to keep the old steam engines on a hot standby, running in the parallel, burning fuel, waiting to take over at the moment the diesel stumbled, which it did, repeatedly. By 1900, the engine had failed completely. Here's the thing about that failure though, because it changes everything that follows. Busch had paid 1 million gold marks for the world's best engine. He had incorporated a company, capitalized it at $1 million, installed the engine in his own brewery, and surrounded it with engineers. What he had not paid for, and apparently had not thought to price, was American crude oil. That one variable, the sulfur content sitting inside every barrel of domestic petroleum, was not a part of any negotiation in Munich. It was not in any contract. It was just waiting in the fuel lines. American crude oil in 1900 carried a significantly higher sulfur content than the Russian or East Indian crude being used at European diesel test sites. High sulfur fuel causes a specific kind of mechanical destruction inside a diesel engine. It gums the injectors, pits the cylinder walls, and destroys the tight tolerance that diesel combustion requires. The European engines were running on cleaner fuel. The American engines, however, were eating themselves alive. What the American diesel engine company's own operational records show is that fuel sourcing complaints were not intermittent, they were persistent, and they were specific. The correspondence between Colonel Meier and the company's operational side during the early 1900s returns repeatedly to the same problem. The fuel arriving at American test sites was not the fuel the European trials had used, and the variance was not random. Whether that variance was the result of Standard Oil's market position over domestic crude supply, or simply the structural reality that American refiners had no commercial incentive to produce a cleaner distillate for a technology that wasn't yet proven, the documentary records doesn't resolve. What it does show is that the fuel quality problem was identified internally, named explicitly, and never solved, and that the engine failures the American diesel engine company reported tracked the fuel complaints almost exactly. So the first company died. By 1900, the Diesel Motor Company of America was dissolving, and Busch had spent his initial investment with nothing to show for it but a broken engine in his own basement. The name changed, but the fundamental approach did not. On January 20th, 1902, the company was restructured as the American Diesel Engine Company, with Busch still at the center as the primary financial force and Colonel Meier and Edward Faust still running the operational side. The goal remained the same: get a working American diesel engine into the market and start collecting licensing fees. Between 1902 and 1912, historical records suggest that American Diesel Engine Company produced only 260 engines total. In that same time period, European manufacturers had deployed thousands. By 1912, a Danish shipping company had already launched the Sealandia, the world's first ocean-going diesel-powered ship, and the Americans weren't anywhere near that conversation. But the production numbers alone don't tell the full story, because Busch held the master patents on compression ignition technology in the United States and Canada. No other American company could legally manufacture or even seriously experiment with diesel engines without his permission. And because his early designs were failing and his licensing terms reflected that chaos, almost nobody wanted a license. The technology sat in legal amber. Fairbanks Morse had engineers who wanted to work on compression ignition. The companies that would eventually become the foundation of American diesel power were sitting on the sideline, legally blocked from the field, and every American firm with the engineering talent to solve the problem was prevented from trying. Rudolf Diesel visited America in 1904 for the first time, and what he found did not encourage him. The American shops lacked the machining precision that his engine demanded. European manufacturers had developed specialized tooling and tight production tolerances specifically for diesel work. But American industrial culture in 1904 was built around heavier, rougher construction, which was fine for steam, but catastrophic for technology that required components machined to a fraction of a millimeter. Diesel left without resolving the problem, returning from a country that was, from his perspective, technically incapable of building his engine correctly. By 1908, the American Diesel Engine Company was in such bad shape that Busch took the step of buying out all the other investors in a fire sale, not because he saw the opportunity, but because he couldn't afford to let the patents fall into receivership and get scattered. He was spending money to protect assets he could not monetize. The total investments at that point had climbed past $3 million, which in today's money is over $120 million. The man who thought he had bought the future was now paying to maintain a future that would not arrive. In 1910, with the core patents due to expire in only 2 years, Busch traveled to Switzerland for what historical accounts describe as negotiations with Sulzer Brothers, one of the premier precision engineering firms in Europe. The negotiation came down to a straightforward exchange. Busch held the American market rights, Sulzer had the engineering expertise to actually build a working engine, and neither was worth much without the other. In May of 1911, the deal was formalized as the Busch-Sulzer Brothers Diesel Engine Company, a three-way venture between Busch, Sulzer Brothers, and Rudolf Diesel himself. It was the first time in nearly 14 years that American diesel operations had genuine precision engineering behind it, and apparently, almost immediately, things started working. The timing, however, was pretty cruel. Rudolf Diesel visited America again in 1912, and by that point he was famous in the way that Edison and Ford were famous, treated as a visionary, covered by the press, feted at dinners, given tours of American factories. But historical assessments of his correspondence from that period suggest that he was appalled by what he found. The American versions of his engine reportedly used heavier castings and less precise tolerances than anything he would have ever accepted in Europe. He had spent 15 years watching his name attached to machines that, in his view, barely resembled what he had designed. Around July 15, 1912, the core American patents expired and the legal wall came down overnight. The companies that had been waiting, the engineers who had been watching Europe pull further ahead every year, moved immediately. American diesel development, which had been locked in a basement in St. Louis for a decade and a half, suddenly had the entire industrial infrastructure of a continental economy behind it. The US Navy, which had been trying to build diesel submarine engines through its contractor New London Ship and Engine Company, a subsidiary of the Electric Boat Company, had been legally boxed out or forced into expensive workarounds for years. And the development that followed the patent expiry moved at a pace that suggests exactly how much pent-up engineering capacity had been sitting idle. And then, within months of the patents expiring, two of the men most responsible for this story were gone. Adolphus Busch died in October of 1913 after pouring more than $3 million into an engine he never successfully commercialized at scale. Rudolf Diesel disappeared from the deck of SS Dresden on September 29, 1913, and his body was never recovered. And whether it was suicide, accident, or something else has never been settled. The command passed to James Harris, who had been general manager throughout the later years of the operation and who would hold together what remained. The Busch Seltzer factory in St. Louis, completed in 1913, the same year both men died, eventually passed through corporate hands and became part of Nordberg Manufacturing Company in 1946. The physical infrastructure Busch had built to finally make the thing work outlasted everyone who had tried to make it work in the first place. James Harris, who had been general manager throughout the chaos, held the remaining operation together until 1929. The companies that inherited the American diesel market, Cummins, Fairbank Morse, and the chain of manufacturers that followed, built the industry Busch had tried and failed to build. The engines that now move freight across every highway in North America, the Bosch fuel ignition systems, the Fairbanks Morse installations going into generator rooms, all of it was downstream from a 15-year delay that naval historians specifically cite as the reason the United States entered the First World War with submarine engines inferior to Germany's U-boats. The Defense Technical Information Center's own archive is direct about it. The mismanagement and misuse of patent rights put American diesel development behind by at least a decade. But here's the thing that makes the Busch story genuinely strange and genuinely different from the easy version of this narrative. He was not a villain. He was suppressing the diesel engine to protect oil interests or coal interests. He believed in it completely, spent a fortune trying to make it work, and failed because American fuel was too dirty, American machinery was too crude, and American industrial culture wasn't ready for a technology that demanded precision. He didn't kill the diesel engine. He bought it, caged it inside a patent monopoly, and then couldn't figure out how to set it free. The question that doesn't have a clean answer is what American diesel development looks like without Busch. Whether the fuel problem and the machining gap would have slowed anyone else down just as badly, or whether a more open field with Cummins, Fairbanks Morse, and a dozen others competing to solve the same problems simultaneously would have closed that decade-long gap years earlier. One man, working alone, holding a cage around a technology he couldn't tame, that's the part that's hard to forgive.